people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Okay, we'll start with this. An interesting bit of news I came across earlier today. Skysports lines up boxing deals with Dana White and Jake Paul. Broadcaster is in talks with promotional companies of UFC Supremo and YouTuber turned fighter after expiry of their previous contract with Boxer, which suggested that they could walk away from the sport. Apparently not. Sky Sports is committed to returning to boxing in a new year with a potential new broadcast deal involving Dana White and Jake Paul's promotional companies. The broadcaster has been the leading force in British boxing since the turn of the century, but industry sources suggested it had been considering its future in the sport in the wake of its 4-year, $36 million deal with Boxer having expired in June. 36 million pounds. Remember, the pound is worth more than the dollar. Boxing's landscape also changed significantly during that period, with Riyadh hosting the majority of the biggest fights, while Britain's two leading promoters, Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren, both have exclusive deals with the streaming service DAZN, in which the Saudi Public Investment Fund is a minority shareholder. So does jumping into bed with Dana White and Jake Paul fill the void left behind by Boxer? Not really, because Boxer was attempting to fill the void left behind by Matchroom, and those are really big shoes to fill still, to where I don't view any of this as an adequate substitute for any of that. However, Sky is determined to maintain its foothold, and while it remains in active discussions with several parties, there is hope that agreements with both Zuffa and MVP can be finalized within the next 2 months. Zuffa is a new venture backed by TKO, which owns the UFC and WWE, and Turki El Sheikh, the Saudi potentate who has spearheaded the country's boxing takeover. Fronted by White, the UFC president's Zuffa inaugural event was the super fight between Saul Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford in September. It plans to stage 12 cards next year, beginning in Vegas on January 23rd, and implement a league structure similar to that of the UFC rather than using boxing's traditional sanctioning bodies. Sky has also held talks with MVP, the company founded by Paul and Nakisa Badarian, who fights Anthony Joshua in Miami in the early hours of Saturday, and his business partner Nakisa Badarian, a former UFC executive, as part of his transformation from YouTuber to professional boxer. Paul has invested heavily into women's boxing. MVP last week announced the signing of Caroline Dubois, who used to box on Sky, the WBC lightweight champion and sister of Joshua's heavyweight conqueror, Daniel Dubois, whose previous fights have all been broadcasted on that platform. Paul has also signed fellow British world champions Chantal Kimran, Ellie Scottney, and Terry Harper, along with former middleweight champion Savania Marshall, and Sky is keen to ensure it remains at the forefront of British women's boxing. Though, as stated, even with that partnership, that's not an adequate substitute for what Matchroom and Boxer were bringing to the table, albeit a cheaper one. If there's anything in it for Sky, in this deal structure, it's that it doesn't cost them as much money to buy the foreign rights to a fight as opposed to staging fights themselves. Jumping into bed with a promoter and providing them with a budget is far more expensive than what they're doing now. Think about it. 36 million pounds on a 4-year deal with Boxer. They're not spending that now, not doing this. It is understood that Sky is hoping to conclude both deals in 4 to 5 weeks, but sources cautioned that there are still points to resolve. The Zuffa deal is the broadcaster's priority, but White is yet to reveal the boxers who will be part of his new league. Zuffa is also still in the process of driving through an amendment to the Muhammad Ali Reform Act, a federal law passed in 2000 to protect boxers from exploitation from promoters, managers, and sanctioning bodies, so that fighters can opt into the league's single champion model. The proposed bill has been met with controversy after the UFC paid $375 million in a settlement to former fighters in 2024 as the result of an antitrust lawsuit that alleged it had monopolized the market and used restrictive contracts.
With Sky Sports, it's all in the name. They're still in the business of sports. They want to still be in the business of boxing, but I don't view these deals as an adequate substitute. Remember that most, if not all, of what Zuffa Boxing is going to be doing is going to be here in the United States. And I hardly think that boxing fans like Lady Chan, for example, is going to be up in her bra and panties to the wee hours of the morning for the latest Vito Milnicki fight.
Oh, I can't miss that Brandon Adams fight. I've got to see that.
Which calls to attention the Zuffa Boxing stable and widespread speculation that it will primarily be comprised of B and C tier fighters. Not the big names, not the Stevensons, not the Lopezes, not the Haneys.
Not the kind of fighters and not the kind of fights that would leave a British boxing fan so inclined to stay up till the wee hours of the morning that even with this deal, you have to account for the time zone difference. And that doesn't just apply to Zuffa, that also applies to MVP. Most, if not all, of what MVP does is in the United States.
Even with their British roster of female fighters, those female fighters in and of themselves, I don't think, are enough to leave a British boxing fan losing sleep to watch Caroline Dubois pounce on an overmatched opponent. I understand that Sky Sports for many years now has made a commitment to advancing the sport of women's boxing, but just what MVP has, that by itself, I don't think it's enough.
The way it's been, the female fights have been complementary to the male fights, and last I checked, MVP does not have a robust stable of male British boxers that British boxing fans would stay up to watch. So, as stated, it's good for MVP, and it's good for Zuffa that they have a foreign broadcast partner in Sky. But for Sky, this is not an adequate substitute to the programming they've been delivering for years.
You cannot compete with Eddie Hearn, and you cannot compete with Frank Warren, their stable, their fights, and their fighters with this.
And that's the bottom line. In men's middleweight news, according to veteran boxing scribe Stephen Kimothy, the word I'm getting is that Janibek's situation played into Crawford's decision to retire. We all know not that long ago, before Janibek popped hot and tested positive for a banned substance, he was in the running for a Crawford fight, provided that he beat Arislan De Lara on the undercard of Cruz versus Roach.
Terence Crawford stated immediately after the Canelo Alvarez fight that he was considering moving down in weight to middle and maybe fighting for a title there. Janibek was the frontrunner up until all of that happened. So what that essentially means is that if this rumor is true, Crawford wasn't going to fight Canelo Alvarez again anyway.
He was likely already going to vacate all the titles that he won from him in that fight, at which point they would have been redistributed anyway.
That means all that hullabaloo about not paying the World Boxing Council sanctioning fees for their belt was much ado about nothing, since Terence, whether he retired or not, he wasn't going to stay at 168, and he wasn't going to keep that belt.
So if, according to Steve, Janibek Alimkhanalai potentially being stripped of his 2 alphabet titles influenced Terence's decision to retire.
What happens now?
I don't think that Janibek has been stripped yet of his 2 alphabet titles, though it's looking a lot like he's going to. And if he is, there's no reason for him to stay in the middleweight division. His undisputed campaign will have fallen by the wayside, but I don't think it would be over for him After that, no sir. How many fighters have we seen over the years test positive for banned substances just to resume their careers a few months later? I don't think it'll be any different for Janibek Alimkhanalai, but I do think he's going to leave the middleweight division. I do think he's going to move up to super middleweight, which I think will make things more interesting for him. I don't think the fighters at 168 are going to be as squirrely around him as the ones at 160 were.
I think it might be easier for Janibek Alimkhanalai to get fights as a super middleweight, though I still think he's going to have to go through the mandatory process. He doesn't have enough marquee value for fighters just to fight him for the sake of fighting him. He's still going to have to do that, but I do think he will be able to get fights. And given his physical dimensions, that Janibek was actually a big middleweight, on the bigger end of the spectrum, I think he'll have plenty of room at 168 to fill out.
I think his power will carry. I think for Janibek Alimkhanalai, not having to cut that extra 8 pounds to make 160, fighting at 168 for him will be a breath of fresh air, and he will arrive in that division reinvigorated, re-energized. It'll take a matter of months. After this whole fiasco over the banned substance is over at 160,
I give it 6 to 8 months before he's back in the ring.
will he be back with Top Rank? In truth, Janibek has not proven a fruitful investment for Top Rank. You know what they were thinking when they signed him, that we've got the next Gennady Golovkin. That does not appear to be the case, and I question Janibek's future with that promotional outfit. But that doesn't mean that he can't fight for somebody else. Queensbury could pick him up.
You know that MVP could pick him up too, to beef up their male stable of fighters. We know they've made a heavy investment in women's boxing, but it wouldn't hurt them to pick up some of the men.
What about Golden Boy? Golden Boy could use the bodies. They're unscrupulous over there. Jumping into bed with a fighter that just tested positive for a banned substance is right up their alley. That's what they're doing with Ryan. Doing it with Janibek would just be more of the same. That if Janibek's relationship with Top Rank has ended, he could always go to them. He could always go to the IBA. They do their own shows.
The ones who used to oversee all of the amateur boxing up until they lost recognition of that from the IOC, they've since thrown their hat in the ring of professional boxing, and they've been staging professional boxing matches. They just staged Gassiev versus Pulev. Janibek could always work something out with them. I could totally see that.
And him integrating himself into what is an already deep super middleweight division makes things that much more interesting for him, for the division, though not so interesting for 160. 160 was already dead as a doorknob. Now without Janibek, there's even less reason to keep up with that weight class.
Nobody's climbing over each other to watch the latest Lara fight or the latest Carlos Adames fight. Remove Janibek Alimkhanalai, and that was the last interesting puzzle piece to that entire weight class.
But just imagine Janibek versus Mabili, Janibek versus Sajo, Janibek versus Resendiz,
Armando Resendiz, he moved up from middle to super middle.
Janibek versus Plant maybe, Janibek versus Charlo if Charlo ever sobers up. So many good and interesting fights to make in the super middleweight division that this could all be a blessing in disguise for Janibek Alimkhanalai.
In men's heavyweight news, Jake Paul claims he is a better boxer than stiff Anthony Joshua, Miami Beach, Florida. There's no shortage of confidence coming from Jake Paul, entering what is unequivocally the toughest test of his career. Paul proclaimed himself the better boxer than two-time unified heavyweight champion and 2012 Olympic gold medalist Anthony Joshua ahead of their clash Friday at the Kaseya Center in Miami. In terms of boxing, I'm a better boxer than AJ, which is hilarious to say. Paul said on Tuesday, he's got 2 left feet, he's stiff. If I was a coach, I'd put him in dance class first before trying to box. I've brought in the right sparring partners to help me prepare so that I can get looks that are similar to him. That's been the strategy, but I'm going to go in there and display all of my skills.
How does this guy reconcile being more skilled than an Olympic gold medalist and a 2-time heavyweight champion when he lost to the likes of Tommy Fury, who's none of those things?
So he doesn't reconcile it. I don't think Jake Paul for a second believes what he's saying, and if he does, he's out of his fucking mind. But that's it. It's either Jake Paul is completely delusional and out of his fucking mind, or he doesn't actually believes what he's saying, and it's all part of the sales pitch. It is all part of the character he displays publicly to elicit a reaction, because he wants to make you mad. He wants to get you involved. He wants you to want him to get knocked out.
Paul, 28, is coming off a one-sided unanimous decision win over former middleweight champion Julio Cesar Chavez on June 28th. He's won 6 straight fights since suffering his lone defeat, a split decision loss to Tommy Fury in February of 2023, approximately 2 years ago.
Making it all the more insane that a guy who couldn't make it past Tommy Fumbles, Tommy Fury, is now fighting Anthony Joshua?
Some people don't even believe what they're seeing. Is this real? Jake is really going to do this? Well, it must be scripted.
In terms of people who would say this is scripted, your response?
I mean, so many people think it's scripted. I don't really know what to tell you. We would never take part in a scripted fight. I think it's the most cringe. Listen, if you want to retire and go on the WWE or whatever, and I mean that's fine. Like, we're not wasting our time here. We're not going in there. There is no part of Anthony Joshua that wants to or will take it easy on Jake Paul or be scripted. This is a real professional contest that AJ has trained for, like he's fighting for the World Heavyweight Championship.
According to Eddie Hearn, it's very much a real fight. It's for real. The sparring partners have been real for Jake Paul. Look at who he hired. Jared Anderson, Lawrence Okoli.
You hire real sparring partners for what is a fake fight?
No, I don't think it's fake. I don't think it's scripted. Anthony Joshua is not that past-it fighter, that faded fighter strapped for cash, looking for a check, and selling himself to the circus, because he has bigger fights to sell in the coming calendar year, to where he would not stake his own reputation being Jake Paul's dancing bear.
He doesn't have to. He's still one of the highest paid boxers in the whole world. So, if he's here, it's gotta be because it's for real.
Though if it's for real, what has Jake Paul lost his mind? Is he delusional? And I don't think he is. I mean, if he were really deluded, he wouldn't have been fighting the kind of guys that he's been fighting. If he really believed he were that good a boxer, he wouldn't have kept busy with so many retired MMA fighters.
Over-the-hill boxers, what, a 56-year-old Mike Tyson tantamount to a senior citizen?
Julio Cesar Chavez, that guy's a fucking junkie. These are not the people that you fight when you believe all in your boxing and you believe you're world class. No, sir. I don't think he's delusional. I think he's cashing out. I think that the circus couldn't go on forever, and there were only so many opponents that could keep Netflix on board.
Netflix is kicking out a lot of money to Anthony Joshua, to Jake Paul, enough that Jake is willing to take on this risk. So whatever he says, it's not because he's delusional, it's because he's trying to get you invested. It's because he's trying to get you on board, ruffle your feathers, piss you off, so that you tune in to watch him get laid out.
Now the crazy white boy who's willing to gamble bodily harm in pursuit of finances. Not dissimilar from what you used to see on Jackass with Johnny Knoxville and Chris Pontius. All of those guys.
What Jake is doing this Friday is not that far removed from what those guys used to do.